Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. From now on, I will be moving to one episode a week, which will go live on a Monday at 7 o'clock, as this just allows me to spend a bit more time to produce episodes of higher quality. At least I hope so. Anyway, today's episode will cover different opinions on international sanctions. For those of you who don't know, international sanctions are essentially penalties applied on a state by the international community, which in this instance essentially means a large gathering of states. Now, sanctions can take many forms, but their most common include travel bans, asset freezing, arms embargoes, capital restraints, foreign aid reductions, and trade restrictions or bans, which are economic sanctions, which are the most common form. Sanctions are used as a means of putting pressure on a state to refrain from a particular course of action that the imposer of the sanctions deems to endanger their own interests. This could include arms dealing with hostile groups such as terrorists, breaching human rights, suppressing democracy, or interference in the affairs of other states. Economists, politicians, and other individuals are divided on how far they believe sanctions to actually work, with some arguing that they are an effective non-combative means of coercion, while others view them as only detrimental to civilian populations and have unintended consequences. In this episode, we will unpick these arguments along with many more. I will be taking the definition of sanctions in the holistic form to include economic sanctions, aid sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, and all other common ways they are used. And while this will not change the overarching debates and opinions, please be aware that the topic goes far deeper than this, and in the description and in all future episodes, I will be providing some links for more comprehensive and detailed explanations and arguments. Quick reminder, the aim of this episode is not to try and argue for or against one side of the debate, but rather to highlight the different opinions on the topic and provide a comparison between them. I will begin with the arguments in favour of sanctions, followed by those opposed, with a comparison at the end. When looking at arguments in favour of sanctions, one of the most commonly forwarded justifications is that sanctions weaken the economy of a perpetrator state through less trade and financial interaction. This provides two key benefits, the first of which being a reduction in government capabilities. Essentially, if the government is receiving less tax revenue and less other revenues in terms of their own sales and financial dealings, they will have less resources to spend on developing armaments, nuclear weapons, funding terrorists, or whatever other bad things they are doing. And furthermore, through the economic pressure placed on the general population, it is argued that this will push them to push the government for change in order for the sanctions to be lifted, and therefore, to some, economic sanctions can act as both a deterrent and an incentive for positive change. And following on from this point, sanctions also reduce a nation's military capability. As I have already said, the government will not have as much money to spend on armaments and military technology, and this means that in the case of a conflict, they will be less able to inflict damage upon their opponent, which means in turn that this is a disincentive for the country to go to war. Perhaps the main recipient of this idea is North Korea, with one of the ideas being that if their army is simply not as well equipped and well armed as it could be if they didn't have sanctions, then its ability to, and as a result, the risk of invading South Korea is greatly reduced. The main target of sanctions tends to be the political, economic, and military elite of a nation. As a result, it is argued that sanctions can put pressure on elites to change, be it through limiting their financial assets, their business dealings, and their resources, or through popular pressure on them to act. It is argued that state elites will be incentivized to change their actions if there are sanctions imposed upon them. Now, one argument supporting international sanctions is that through the building of a coalition of unified states to impose these sanctions, there is more power behind the sanction than merely a unilateral or minimal multilateral action by states. If half of the world states have put sanctions on you and are restricting interactions with you, then it is argued that you will, as a result, be far more likely to work to have these sanctions removed. And even if a state isn't swayed by the moral weight of all these states, the sheer economic cost of restricting such a large group of potential partners can also be enough to push a state to act. It is also often the case that sanctions are used by Western liberal states to promote democracy and human rights. Often, sanctions are imposed upon states which breach human rights and violate democracy within their country, and as such, through sanctions, as mentioned above, the pressures placed on elites and governments can cause them to follow and promote democratic reforms. A good example of this is very recently with President Biden, who has suggested potentially increasing the already existing sanctions on Myanmar, also known as Burma, following the military coup which has overthrown a democratically elected government. Now, one of the big appeals of sanctions is that it is a non-combative form of international coercion. Essentially, many diplomats are drawn to it given that they do not have to launch military action or other serious forms of retaliation. This not only creates less overall cost to their actions, but also opens the door to react in situations where no other option would be available. If the only reaction before could have been military intervention, and they don't want to start a war, a state could not get involved, but now through sanctions they are able to push their agenda and positive ideals without the aforementioned costs of, for example, military intervention. Now, a policy area with growing popularity in recent decades has been that of so-called smart sanctions. Now, these are highly targeted sanctions aimed at either specific individuals, organisations or industries within an economy or country, be it a political leader or specific company. Smart sanctions allow the international community to respond to potentially harmful actions without incurring a higher cost on the general population of the inflicted state, and as such, smart sanctions can help reduce the unintended consequences of actions in regards to sanctions, and therefore some argue that you have the benefits of sanctions without the costs of the traditional means, and as such, smart sanctions are a very popular idea. And then finally, for those arguments in favour of sanctions, we have examples that people often point to. Firstly is that of the Iran nuclear deal, which is one of the most prominent and recent examples of sanctions in part succeeding in their purpose. It is argued that through the incentive to have sanctions removed, Iran was brought to the negotiating table when it may not have otherwise been as inclined. Furthermore, some have argued that North Korean sanctions have been successful insofar as they have limited the nation's ability to procure a sizable and technologically advanced enough army to realistically conceive invading South Korea. The country operates a deterrent military, which is far more favourable than an offensive one, and therefore sanctions are supported as a means of non-violent coercion which push for a specific ideal or action. Now for those opposing sanctions. What you will find with arguments opposed to sanctions is that they generally tend to criticise the unintended consequences that come about and question the effectiveness of the intended consequences. The first of these is an idea that sanctions cause an increase in corruption. Essentially, as a nation's resources dwindle due to sanctions, only those with pre-existing power bases will be able to source revenue and resources, and thus their own power will increase. This is based off the idea that sanctions harm the general population more than the elite, and in this case, sanctions, economically at least, tend to harm those who are already poor, and those who are already rich and corrupt will continue to be so. Now, another unintended consequence are that economic sanctions can also harm the economy of the perpetrator states. Through banning trade with China or Iran, US suppliers have lost large customer bases, especially given that Chinese sellers can just go anywhere else and Iranian buyers can buy from anywhere else. And in this case, China is now Iran's biggest trading partner. And as such, some have argued that all these sanctions have sought to do is foster ties between hostile nations and reduce and harm the US economy, given that there is less trade going on. Another unintended consequence of sanctions is that they may in fact promote rather than dissuade conflict. As a nation state's resources become scarcer and scarcer, it may become more and more desperate and have nothing to lose at a certain point if they are very poor. Combined with increased disillusionment and potential anger within a nation's population towards those imposing sanctions, this could result in a nation's most feasible course of action being a war. Following Trump's reimposition of sanctions against Iran, for example, they have acted with increasing hostility in the Strait of Hormuz, which has included seizing and occupying commercial trading vessels. Now, following on from this, the idea of dissatisfaction and opposition within the recipient country may lead some to believe that sanctions can actually increase the voice for anti-reformers. In many countries that have sanctions imposed upon them, they flip the argument around and make it seem as if they are the victims. There is a fear that this has occurred dramatically in North Korea and Iran, with both populations being incredibly hostile to the United States and their allies, and as such, the suffering that has been inflicted on them is not blamed on their leaders as much, but rather blamed on those who impose sanctions, and as such, this may cause a strong nationalist movement and strong anti-reform movements, which can be counterproductive to the change the sanctions seek to cause. And the fear for this point is that over time this can get worse and can lead to long-term alienation between different countries. If you have very long economic sanctions combined with limited interaction due to diplomatic sanctions over a very long period of time, this can result in alienation between states. And this could result in states never lifting sanctions as they never cooperate with each other. And as such, sanctions over a very long period of time become less of a tool and more of the status quo, which all it serves to do is foster resentment towards the nation or community that imposes sanctions. A lot of this resentment comes from the humanitarian crises that often accompany economic or aid sanctions. When looking at countries that have sanctions on them, for example North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba and Iran, we find that in all of them, the general populations are the ones who have suffered the most through these sanctions, with lower wages, limited healthcare, food and access to scarce resources. It is the people within these countries that are the ones suffering, and given the elites simply do not care, and given that these are not democracies in the general sense and popular pressure won't lead to any change, to some, all these sanctions have sought to do is harm the general populations without achieving any actual policy objectives. Another big problem with international sanctions is that they are imposed without consensus often, and this can cause international disputes. Now, this typically occurs between the US and her allies and Russia and China, with both countries engaging diplomatically and economically with Iran, and particularly China with their relations to North Korea. There are often poles of influence created with the imposition of sanctions between the West, which often imposes them, and the East, which often ignores them. As a result, instead of serving to foster an international resolve to help the people suffering under pariah regimes, sanctions may instead serve to foster wider conflicts and polarity, especially in the Middle East and Korean Peninsula. Given that sanctions don't work in a lot of cases then, you may wonder why countries use them. And to those opposed to sanctions, we often find that they believe the motive to be nothing more than a political virtue signalling tool. A country may be heavily resistant to engage in action to respond to, for example, breaches of human rights. However, through sanctions, they can at least make it appear that they care and are taking action to oppose what they believe are the harmful events. And this won't really backfire, because although an economy is harmed, it's not harmed to the same extent as the one that has sanctions imposed upon it, especially in the US, where it's such an economic superpower that sanctions on Iran really won't harm it. And as such, to some people, sanctions are merely a means to gain political brownie points without the large political costs of, for example, sending soldiers off to die in battle. Now, responding to the pushback on this point that smart sanctions are used to only affect specific groups, many people argue that smart sanctions still harm the general population and their effect is limited. For example, if you freeze a political leader's foreign assets, all they may do then is simply steal more wealth from their own population, and preventing a dictator from gaining a visa to your country is unlikely to cause them to promote a democratic revolution. And honestly, it is due to the sad lack of dictators not crying that they cannot go on holiday to California that we do in fact have many examples of sanctions not working. This includes sanctions on Libya, which failed, and Colonel Gaddafi wasn't found hiding in a sewer due to failed holiday plans, but rather due to NATO airstrikes and a civil war. Kim Jong-un, likewise, is not wallowing in self-pity, but rather continues to reap the benefits of exploiting his population and now has a few nuclear bombs. The travel bans on Cuba did not remove Fidel Castro, and neither did the 638 assassination attempts. And Trump's sanctions on Iran have not pushed them back to the renegotiating table, or led their supreme leader to going on holiday. Moving on now to the comparison. Firstly, on the economy. Those supporting sanctions believe that economic pressure leads to change. Firstly, you limit a country's ability to make weapons and be an economic power through their sanctions, and you also have the general population pushing for change, given that they suffer likewise. However, those on the other side would argue that all economic sanctions serve to do is harm the imposer of the sanctions and lead to economic costs for the general population and not the elite because of corruption and the fact that they already control all the key resources. On the question of does it cause conflict, those supporting sanctions argue that given a country is less able to produce weapons, recruit people and have an army, conflict is far less likely. However, those on the other side believe that at a certain point countries become more desperate, which may push them to war or could invoke a civil war. Either way, it wouldn't be favourable. On the question of who does the public support, those supporting sanctions believe that using sanctions leads the public to put pressure on elites and push the public for change, and that they will support the general idea behind these sanctions. However, those on the other side would say that often it pushes people away from whoever initiates the sanctions, especially long term. Often, elites are simply too powerful to be quickly replaced. These don't occur in democracies, so popular pressure won't really do much, and given the general population suffers, they may turn their back on whoever imposes the sanctions. On the question of who suffers from the sanctions, those supporting them believe that it is the elites who suffer the most, especially with smart sanctions. They are the ones who lose resources, they lose money, they lose assets and they lose support, and ultimately they are the ones who have to change. However, those on the other side believe that it is the general population who suffers. The elites are the ones who have the means to stay rich when things get tough. The general population don't, and as such they may turn to elites for aid and support, which fosters resentment towards the imposer of the sanctions and merely means that the elites maintain their power and potentially increase it. On the question of what are the international effects, those supporting sanctions believe that it shows solidarity when many states in the international community agree to participate in a deal. It puts more pressure on the receiver of the sanctions and shows a general resolve. However, those on the other side believe that it can cause problems, especially when states disagree. When you have the West and the East disagreeing over sanctions with Iran, for example, it can create polarities of influence which in the long term may foster more conflict, can cause proxy wars, and can cause escalation of local wars into something far more dangerous. On the question of does lots of states or an international sanction actually cause change, those believing it does argue that having lots of states involved puts more pressure on the state that has sanctions imposed upon them. both due to the moral weight of all of these states acting against them, and also due to the economic costs of so many lost potential partners. However, those on the other side argue that it doesn't make a difference. These are pariah states. They go against the norm. They don't care to begin with, hence why they have sanctions imposed upon them, and they're not going to care afterwards. Then on the question of what is the actual motive behind the sanctions, those supporting them argue that they are a peaceful means of coercion which can promote democracy, human rights and other positive actions without going to war. However, those opposed believe that they are more political showcasing. They are used to show desire, to act for political praise and to show that you care without actually acting, and they are very limited in their effects and their costs outweigh this. On the question of smart sanctions, those favouring them believe that they can target a specific area within a country or economy and thus limit the unintended consequences and cost to the general population. Those on the other side, however, believe that smart sanctions have a similar effect to regular sanctions. They're impractical, they don't work, and they still inflict costs on the general population, and as such are still a waste of time. Questioning then examples, those favouring sanctions may point to the Iran nuclear deal as an example where sanctions have worked and have pushed Iran to act, and in a paradoxical way, the fact that sanctions being reimposed have caused problems has shown that the initial introduction and then removal of sanctions to get them to talk is what worked to begin with. However, those opposing it point to all the examples where sanctions haven't worked. Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro is still in power. If you look at North Korea, Kim Jong-un is still in power. You look at Cuba, the Castro regime is still in power. And as such, all of these are prime examples of why sanctions do not work and cause more costs than benefits. Overall then, those supporting sanctions believe that they can be targeted, can put pressure on states and elites to act, and serve as a better alternative to other forms of hard power, such as military intervention. Those opposing them, however, believe that the actual benefits of sanctions are very limited. However, the costs are very high, and as such, they are merely a bad policy idea. Despite their unpopularity, however, we will likely continue to see sanctions imposed on weaker states which cannot retaliate to the US and their allies. And if the US continues with their long list of sanctions, we will likely see an increased polarity between the West and the rising sun in the East. Don't worry though, there is still hope for the future, with a rise in the call for so-called smart power, which uses sanctions, however, as a part of a wider policy strategy. Perhaps the best example of this is in fact the Iran nuclear deal, which involved coercion and sanctions with negotiation and economic incentives, and until Trump withdrew the US from the deal, it seemed to be working relatively well. It does therefore seem that sanctions have a future in some capacity, and with the rise of smart power, we may continue to see them used in more effective ways. However, it waits to be seen whether states believe smart power to be a good action, and whether in the long run we will see whether or not it actually turns out to be a good strategy. Ultimately though, what do you think on this issue? Do you believe we should have sanctions, we shouldn't have sanctions, and either way, how far should sanctions go? And is there anything that I missed, got wrong, or could do better? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter. And be sure to check back on Monday for another episode, which will most likely be on some form of immigration. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.